helping your child to meet their birth parents and learn about their biological history will probably produce really significant positive impacts for them and on the rest of their lives and their relationships with their family and people around them.
Welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a show about adoption, foster care, advocacy, and becoming the best caregiver possible. Pull up a chair. We're glad you've joined us. Here are your hosts, Mike and Kristen Berry.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast. We are so glad you are joining us for Season 29, Episode 278. Wherever you are in the world, we love you. You are doing good work, and your story isn't over. It's something we say to caregivers all the time, but we want to send that energy your way as you listen to this show. This is going to be a great interview. We are joined by Don Brushaber, who is an adult adoptee, and he shares some amazing insights from his personal journey of being adopted, growing up, and then wrestling through feelings of abandonment in his adult years, and incredible insight to offer to us as caregivers. You will love his story. Just a heartfelt, heartwarming conversation. He is from the U.S. but lives in London. I know we have a lot of listeners in the U.K., and you guys are going to love hearing from him. But wherever you are in the world, in the 50, 60-some different countries that we have audience members from, you're going to love this, and we're glad you're here. If you are new to the show, welcome to you. My name is Mike Berry, along with Kristen Berry. We're your hosts. I forgot to say it at the beginning, but if you're new and you're like, who are these people? Mike Berry, Kristen Berry. We also have a co-host named Nicole Jurgis who joins us from time to time. Make sure you jump over to honestlyadoption.com/podcast. Check out our past episodes, and you can even learn about the work that we do at the Honestly Adoption Company. We are all about helping caregivers become the best caregiver possible, and we do that by bringing insights, strategies, encouragements from the journey to help you reframe your perspective on your child and how to respond differently to them. That's what we're all about. And even if you're a caseworker, a medical, therapeutic professional, we want to help you do the best job possible as well. And we hope that you gain that from this show. Again, we're glad you're here. You're going to love our conversation with Don. So inspiring, so encouraging. So let's get right to it. On with the show. Hey, Don, welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Mike and Kristen, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. We're excited to hear your story, excited to have you on the show, and really excited for our listeners to hear your story. And with that said, that's the place to start right there. We want to have just kind of open up space for you to share your story, your connection to adoption, and anything else that fun fact, you name it, right? The floor is yours, my friend.
Great. Well, thanks for that opportunity. I really appreciate that. So my story is that I was born in 1974 in Beverly, Massachusetts, to a single mother who couldn't raise me. And her one stipulation for putting me for adoption was that I be raised by a Christian family. So 5 days after I was born, a common friend between my parents and my birth mother negotiated worked out an adoption, and I was placed with my family. And when I was about 5 years old, I was told that I was adopted by my parents. And I'm sure they did it to express the love that they had for me, the privilege that they experienced as adoptive parents. But I didn't realize at the time that I internalized that to mean that I was rejected by my birth parents and felt abandoned as a result of that. Well, I ended up living a fairly normal life. I didn't realize I had some fairly strong feelings about being adopted, but I had learned to suppress them. And so ended up living a fairly non-eventful life. I graduated from college, got a job, got married, had kids, moved to London in 2013. And for all intents and purposes, if you looked at my life, you'd say it was fairly normal. And if you had asked me if there were any issues in my life, from being adopted, I would definitely have said no. And I probably would have been confused by the question. And then in 2020, as a result of a lot of things happening in life, stress at work and issues with our visa, impacts from 2 national lockdowns for COVID in the UK, I had a nervous breakdown and entered professional counseling. And after 7 months of counseling, I came to realize that I had internalized these feelings of abandonment from my adoption, and that those feelings were having significant impacts in my life.
Yeah.
And so I worked through the training and through the counseling, and it was fantastic. And I came to terms with, who I was and why I felt the way I did. It helped me to make a lot of sense of my life and why I behaved the way that I did. And I'm a fairly religious person. I'm a devout Christian. And there was a time I remember walking my dog in the park near my house and having this sense that God was telling me that I, for my entire life, had really idolized my birth parents and especially my birth mother. And that in the Christian belief, God is supposed to be the center of your life. And so I confessed that was the case and went about changing my life. And it was a month later, almost to the day, that I flew to America, saw my mom, had intended to ask her for my birth parents' contact information, and she just gave it to me without being asked. I was absolutely floored. So I got my birth mother's name and email address, and then was so nervous. I think I spent 3 or 4 weeks drafting an email, drafting and rewriting and editing and showing it to my wife and getting feedback and reconstructing it till I finally sent it off. Super nervous, unsure how she would respond, if she would respond. And 11 days later, she came back with a really warm, genuine, kind email and said that she was really interested in engaging. So we spent the next 10 months getting to know each other via email, via texts, via phone calls. And then in June of 2022, we met for the first time. She came to London. We met at Heathrow Terminal 3 arrivals. And we spent 2 weeks together, just getting to know each other, just catching up kind of on life. And she met my wife, she met my kids, and it was really just a magical time. And while she was here, I reached out for the first time to my birth father and sent him off an email, thought he'd take a couple of days, maybe a week to respond. And he responded in less than 24 hours. And so I was kind of floored. But he was clearly eager to engage and to communicate, and that was fantastic. And in November of 2022, he and I met for the first time in Manhattan. And I spent the day with him and then met his wife and his daughter, my half sister. Super warm, super welcoming, very kind. Couldn't have had a better experience. And then the next day I flew to meet my birth mother again, and then met 2 of my half brothers. Again, really kind and welcoming, very warm. They were amazing. And then I met my birth mother's husband, same way, welcoming, very kind. And I spent about 10 days with her at her house. And so things were going amazingly well, probably as well as you could have expected for having 2 adoption reunions. And then it was only a couple of months ago, maybe in April of 2023, where I started to realize that there were other impacts emotionally and mentally from my adoption that I didn't realize, that I was still, in the fog quite a bit. And it's just been these last few months that I've started to unpack that and realize what they were and to work through them. And so that's where I find myself today, still, working through a lot of those issues, learning how to manage that part of my life and to move on in a really healthy way.
I so appreciate you sharing a little bit of your story and with such openness. I know that as I'm listening in from a parent perspective, as an adoptive parent, as a foster parent, but also as the older sister of a child, now an adult, who was adopted. My my younger sibling was adopted. My grandma was adopted. My grandpa grew up in foster care, but I'm always on the outside of that, watching how all of these people that I love navigate those feelings of loss and then connection. And so I really appreciate that, because I think so many of our families are listening in and don't have that firsthand experience. So a lot of what we'll hear is a little bit of what you're describing before that moment that you knew you needed to connect. A lot of families are saying, yeah, but like, what about my kid who says, I'm fine. I'm fine. You've always been my parents. This is a great life. We have one. We have 9 kids and we have one whose response is always that. Why do you keep asking me about my adoption? You've always been my parents. What's the big deal? And we know. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about this particular child and thinking, I see the impact that it has on you, but that's the place that child is right now. Just saying,
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it. I don't really see what the big deal is. You're my parents. Everything's good. So I think that that's going to be such a valuable perspective for all of us parents who especially are raising those kids who are saying life's pretty good. I wrote down a couple things while you were talking just about that internalized rejection. And I think if you could expand a little bit more on that, I would appreciate that. I know that that's something that I think a lot of parents who are learning and trying to understand the perspective of their kids are beginning to realize is a daily impact. I'm pausing on my words because I want to say it the way that I mean it. I see it in the way that everyone always says I look like my mom, because I do. And I talk like my mom, and I'm aging like my mom. And that comes up, all the time.
Which is a good thing,
Someone will
by the
say-
way. It's a good thing.
Right. Yes.
Thanks. I'll tell my mom you said
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Just want to put that in there.
Right. No, I mean, it is.
is.
It is. But those kind of comments will come up all the time. Someone will say, I don't live near my mom. So someone will say, oh my gosh, I knew that was your mom immediately when I saw you guys at the coffee shop. You look exactly like her. I watch the faces of my kids as they are processing through what that means. They're not going to look like me. They're not going to look like her. I think that that's a tension, certainly still having kids in my home, but even my grown-up kids, that's a tension that we're living with a lot. Could you talk a little bit more about what that felt like from that moment that you knew you were adopted?
So when I knew I was adopted at a young age, I don't know if I had an immediate impact. I mean, I was quite young. I was probably 5 years old or thereabouts. But in reflecting back on my life and looking at my behaviors and my attitudes, I realized that I really had a strong fear that I would be abandoned and rejected by my parents, as I incorrectly thought I had been by my birth parents. And I couldn't at that age have articulated that thought. I probably didn't realize it, but it was very real. And there were impacts to that. So, I was a fairly well-behaved child. I didn't get into a lot of trouble. I didn't cause a lot of problems. I did fairly well in school. But there were other ramifications, such as I really followed my parents' interests in life because I really wanted them to like me. I really wanted them to please me. So there are certain aspects of life that I didn't pursue. For example, neither of my parents are terribly athletic. So I never really invested much time or energy in athletics, and really now at this age wish that I had done that. But I didn't out of, I think, kind of a subconscious fear that, I'd be rejected if I pursued an avenue that my parents didn't like, right? And so there were times along the way in my life where I made these decisions, I think completely unconsciously, to align to behaviors and approaches to life, or to attitudes or behaviors that my parents would like. I don't think I would have realized that until I had this nervous breakdown when I was in my mid-40s. And everybody's different, right? Some people will be much more self-aware. Some kids or young adults will be much more self-aware and understand that about themselves at a younger age. For me, if I had tried to come to terms with this in my 20s, it would have been a disaster, because I just was not that self-aware. So I think parents need to respect that every child is different. And even if you think your child is struggling in this area, you kind of need to let them come to this realization. You can kind of helpfully suggest or inquire to try to get them to think about if these issues exist in their life, and that's great. But they need to come to this realization on their own, in their own time. And I think that's the healthiest way for them to come to this realization.
Yeah.
So one thing you said, Kristen, that struck me when you made the comment about saying, somebody said that you look like your mom and you age like your mom. I remember the first time somebody saying that I looked like my birth mother. And I mean, I almost broke down in tears. Just on the spot, because I'd never looked like anybody before. Yeah. And I had no idea I would have that reaction. But every time I uncover something about either of my birth parents, my birth father is really jumpy at loud noises, and as I am, and my birth mother and I both get car sick really easily. Anytime I uncover one of these things, it's just like a revelation. Yeah. And it's so moving and impactful, because for 47 years, I didn't look like anyone. I didn't act like anyone, right? I was completely my own person without any biological tethers or behavioral, kind of descendancies from people that I knew, right? So that was a really big and impactful revelation for me when people started commenting like that to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's moving, because, I'm thinking about the parents in our audience, and I'm not picking on any parent in particular, but this is a struggle for adoptive and foster parents, because I think there's still this stigma around birth parents that we are, along with some of our dear partners like Ashley Mitchell, among some, that are just working to change the perspective and change the narrative. And, I hear you talking, and I'm like, what a beautiful thing to realize, to hear that for the first, and realize, oh my gosh, I finally, someone said I look like somebody, right? Like this makes it all real. What would you say to parents who still struggle with, this tension that they feel towards birth parents, that we believe, obviously there are some situations where birth parents there's different scenarios, maybe unsafe, or maybe, it's not a healthy situation, but the parent that struggles just in general with who they are as a parent, and who their child's birth parent is, right? I mean, one of the things that Kristen has said often, and we've said this to our audience often, is that get used to sharing, because that is what this journey is all about, right? Come to terms with that and celebrate. We have this stance. I would say it's a stance against criminalize. We don't ever want to criminalize or, vilify a birth parent, but there are still parents that struggle with that. And there's a lot of different reasons that an adoptive or foster parent struggles with that. But what would you say to the parent who is struggling with that in particular, right? They still look at a birth parent in a negative light. We see this all the time. And from your perspective, I'd love to hear your advice on that, your thoughts.
That's a great question. And I have a slightly unique perspective on that. So I have one sister who is also adopted. She is a little more than 5 years older than me.
Yeah.
And she found out who her biological mother was when she was around 30 years old, 29, 30 years old.
Mm.
And I was 24 at the time. So it's 24, 25 years before I found out of, who my birth parents were. And I have this question in my mind I've never articulated to my parents. Why did you wait so long to share this information? You had a friend who kind of arranged the adoption between my birth mother and yourselves. And so you had access to her information. Why did you wait so long, especially knowing that my sister knew her birth mother for decades, right? And I think if the answer that I play out in my mind is that my mother especially would probably be very fearful and very nervous about losing me emotionally, losing my allegiance, and going, to abandoning them in a sense for my birth parents. And while that would never happen, I could understand why somebody might fear that, why my mother might fear that. And so perhaps that's an issue for some adoptive parents, a very legitimate issue. What I would kindly add to that from an adoptee's perspective is while that fear and other reasons are completely legitimate and understandable, knowing someone's birth parents and biological heritage, in relationships and circumstances that are safe, as you mentioned, is a critical part of their identity. And it's really it really has helped me mentally and emotionally to learn about my birth parents, to meet my birth parents. It's helped me get a broader, more well-rounded view of myself. It's helped me to make sense of behaviors in my life. It's helped make sense of why I feel or act in certain ways that were mysterious to me before. And so if there is fear or there are other factors that are preventing adoptive parents from wanting to connect with birth parents or are creating a negative view about birth parents, again, they're very real. But at the same time, don't forget, helping your child to meet their birth parents and learn about their biological history will probably produce really significant positive impacts for them and on the rest of their lives and their relationships with their family and people around them.
I think it's really insightful. I had a conversation with one of my kids the other day, and it's interesting to me, his perspective on that. And it's a lot of what you're describing right now. And the conversation went like out of the blue. This child got out of the car and said, Mom, you're my mom. And I want you to know that just because I'm spending a lot of time with my grandma and grandpa, my biological grandma and grandpa, doesn't mean that I don't want to be with you. You're always going to be my mom.
Aww.
And I wasn't worried about that, but I'm not worried about that at all. And I thought that Mike and I were communicating that we were not worried about that at all. There is plenty of room to be connected to your biological family and us. We think you're amazing. We love all the parts of you that came from everywhere. This child in particular is fascinated with things that Mike and I do not understand, like at all. So it's engines. He talks about engines. He's like, I cannot wait to tell you about this engine. And I'm like, oh, yay. But it's
which we know nothing about, clearly.
I really do not know what you're
anything
saying
about engines. Yeah.
Wow.
but truly, I thought we were communicating something different. Does that make sense? I mean, I really thought that this kid was walking with confidence in both identities. And
Yeah.
I'm glad that you touched on that a little, because that was sort of that conversation. Like, even though I thought we were expressing one thing as the adoptive family, our child was still carrying some of that, and probably still is, even after saying that uncertainty. Is it okay for me to look like my grandma? Is it okay for me to be interested in, engines and fixing things like my grandpa? Is it okay that, whatever it is? And I mean, of course it's okay. And
Right.
even in a family where we legitimately thought that we were expressing, we arranged that connection. We moved closer to the grandparents. We really thought we had expressed one thing, but our child was still doing a lot of what you're describing too. Oh, I like the things you like, mom and dad. Like, that's
Yeah.
really okay. You don't
Yeah.
have to. We have tons of connections without us being exactly the same.
Yeah. So if I could share an insight on that, that's a really
Absolutely.
story, and thank you for sharing it. And I'm really, one thing I'd say off the bat is I'm really glad, as you mentioned earlier, that you guys talk about these things. My family growing up didn't talk a lot about these kinds of issues. Didn't really talk about them at all, if I'm honest. So the fact that you guys are having these conversations and your kids feel free to talk about their feelings and their thoughts in these areas, that's amazing. What initially comes to mind, Kristen, in hearing that story and what your child is processing mentally is a analogy or maybe a model that a friend of mine told me once, that families are like a big sailboat, like a big racing sailboat with a crew on it. And everybody in the family has a position on the boat. And whether or not it's the right position, kind of leave that to the side for now, right? But they've got a place on the boat and they have a certain function. They raise the sail, they steer the rudder, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, when someone new comes on the boat, people are confused about where that person should stand, what their role should be. Does somebody else have to move from their place, to the side, or, how are these responsibilities going to be divvied up? And that's hard enough when you have kind of one family model or one family structure. And then when you start to add in layers and complexities like birth families, for me, it's multiple birth families, my birth father's family, my birth mother's family. As an adult, it's really hard to keep that all straight, to the point where when people nowadays ask me about my family, if they're a new, somebody that I'm meeting for the first time, I just tell them it's complicated because I can't always figure it out myself. And then if you think, I'm not sure what age your child is, but if you think about trying to do that as a young person, that's really hard, right? To really solidify the fact that, you've got a really large boat, or sometimes you pass from one boat to another and back again, and that's all okay. But it's maybe what you're hearing is your child just trying to solidify that in his or her mind, that this is okay. And that's how they feel. And saying it out loud just helps them to lock that model down in their mind that this is how their life is. And it's okay. And it's great. Right. So maybe they're just kind of self-affirming perhaps in what they're doing.
Absolutely. I always want to say something better in response to things. And then I'm like, yes, right.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. I agree.
Yeah.
Right. No, I'm really mulling over that analogy and really thinking about how that applies. And I think that as our kids are getting older, when they were younger, we could write the narrative. Not that we meant that out of a control, which it now feels like, but we were in charge of whether or not we connected with, met up at the park, went over to so-and-so's house for Thanksgiving, whatever that is. Yeah. So we were in charge of that. So we would say, oh, you have a beautiful smile, just like your mom. Look, you love art, just like me. So we were kind of it's okay to exist in all those places, but we're the writer of that story because they're little.
Yeah.
As they're getting older, that's exactly what we're seeing happen. They're jumping from boat to boat. They're visiting without us. Because they're old enough to do that now, to have a grandparent pick them up, or to get on a plane and go stay with their grandparents for a week, or, something like that, to actually pick up a phone and call. We always just say parents, and I guess for the sake of a podcast, because we're talking about having a large family, they're biological parents. They're now navigating that themselves. And I think that's got to be very complex for them to do and to figure out their place in those worlds.
Yeah. And we also, I think that the thing that I am grateful for, that we have made it a point for a long time now, is helping our kids to know that there's not just in terms of that relationship with birth family and birth parents, just, making that it's normal, right? It's not weird. Right. And I think that is something that I remember back to, years and years ago. We're talking like 13 years ago, when we were fostering two of our kids. Their paternal and maternal grandmothers actually chose us out of a panel of other parents. There were like 3 or 4 couples. It was really interesting. And I remember in the initial meeting, all of us sitting around a table, one of the grandmothers, and they were really emotional. This was super emotional, because it was a realization that their kids did not have the means to take care of these 2 children, and they had to find another. That's got to be, the weight of that has to be, I can't even imagine. Right. And one of the questions they asked was, if we chose you, would you, could we still be involved in the kids' lives? And I couldn't believe this, but the other 3 couples said no. And that floored me, because I'm like, why wouldn't you want the territory of family and people to be expanded as far as you possibly could have it? Right. That was just a natural response for us. It's like, there's no reason to say no to this whatsoever. Right. One of the things that we continue to impress on foster adoptive parents is, making this very normal, if that makes sense. Right. It has to be that way. This is family, this is connection, this is heritage, and it is to be celebrated. So it's just, that's what comes to mind for me.
I'm completely on board with that, Mike. I can't remember if I mentioned at the top, but my adoption was a closed adoption. And I think that was much more common in the time when I was adopted. I'm not sure how common that is in the US anymore. But the problem for me with a closed adoption as a child, but even as an adult, if I'm frank, is that I was left up to myself to figure out why I was adopted, right? I did what a lot of people would do, and I catastrophized, right? I went to the worst possible answer and kind of took hold of that and said, I must be just, unlovable, or I must have been abandoned. There must have been something fundamentally wrong with me. And then, we never really, as a family, ever talked about our my or my sister's biological family. So it was really abnormal, right? It was this huge elephant in the closet that I kind of had stuffed away. So I didn't ever talk about it or think about it. But I completely agree that had my biological parents been involved in my life at some stage, maybe not 5 years old, but maybe, for me, it might have been appropriate at 18. For other people, maybe different ages. But I think that would have done me a world of good in terms of my mental and emotional health. And so, I really hope that as adoptive and foster parents out there are thinking about their relationship and their child's and children's relationships with their biological parents, that they really consider making that connection, because questions about heritage and ancestry and all that, are an important part of our identity,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it really helps us form healthy and positive identities if we have that background story to our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure. I want to, if we have just a couple more minutes, I want to touch a little bit on what you've talked about in terms of mental health and that step that you took in adulthood to process through, all of those feelings that you've had and, your identity and your sense of abandonment and learning the whole story. And how did you begin to process that in a healthy way?
That's a great question. The first time I came to terms with the fact that I had feelings of abandonment was when I had a nervous breakdown. So it was almost forced upon me, but I was really honest with myself that these feelings were there and I was open to the possibility of them being there because I wanted to get better. So even though they were there and they were there my entire life, I wasn't open to them until that point. And at the point where I knew I needed to get healthier, I became receptive to the idea that, okay, maybe there's something associated with my adoption that's been impacting me all these years, and I really need to honestly look at it. And then after identifying, accepting those feelings, I went for a number of months or even a year or more and met my birth mother and my birth father until I came across some information in a news story about adoptees talking about common struggles mentally that adoptees have. And I thought, well, it's probably a story about, I felt abandoned and I felt, like my birth parents walked away from me. And that was part of it. But there were so many other impacts from adoption that adoptees can have. So I, for example, have always struggled with suppressed feelings of anger and sadness that would just come up in my life. And I didn't know where they came from. I didn't know when they would come. I didn't have a great way to control them. And they were tools that I was subconsciously using to suppress my grief. And as I read up more and more on adoption and impacts that adoptees commonly have with mental health, I really started to reflect in my life and say, okay, what are these impacts do I have? And are there other impacts that I have that might not be appearing in these articles that are unique to me? Because at that point, I knew, having done that same exercise with the feelings of abandonment, even though it was going to be a hard journey, it would end up at the end being better for me from a mental and emotional health perspective. So I just started to process through those thoughts, those feelings, went on a lot of long walks, talked to family and friends, kind of worked through those feelings, because I knew, again, at the end of the day, it was going to help me to be better mentally and emotionally. So it's just having the willingness and the self-awareness, I guess, in answer to your question, Kristen, to be able to explore these ideas, look to other resources to see if there's commonalities between yourself and other stories of other adoptees and foster kids, and just be brave and take that step. And to also, there are great resources out there, this podcast, books, articles, friends, family members who can talk things through with you that can also help you through that journey, right? People don't have to do this alone. There's a lot of resources out there to help people through this difficult journey.
Don, we are so grateful that you have joined us for this episode. I think that this is, as one of the things we said off air, the term we used off air was life-giving. I think this is life-giving for adult adoptees who are listening to the show, life-giving for birth parents. We have an audience of birth parents that listen in, and foster and adoptive parents. So thank you so much. I think it really points to the fact that, healing is a journey. And while I know there are a lot of parents out there that would say, well, my child seems really well adjusted and seems like everything is normal. And one of the things that we always want to encourage parents is keep a finger on the pulse of what your child is processing and what they're experiencing. And I think that you have done such a great, amazing job at helping caregivers understand that through your own journey. So thank you so much.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on again. And I really do hope that it has been life-giving to your entire audience, whatever their background is, whatever their role with adoption or fostering is. And I completely agree. Healing is a journey. And I only came to realize that a few years ago, but it definitely is. And so hopefully this is a part in that journey that helps people, heal from griefs that they've had in the past.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We know a lot of people out there are probably have additional questions. They would love to, to pick your brain a little bit, especially caregivers who are just they're trying to navigate these tricky waters of, their child feeling those abandonment feelings and things like that. So if that's you, if you want to ask a question of Don, the best way to do that is to send us an email at hello@honestlyadoption.com. And then we will get that over to Don, like we do with all of our other experts and guests on the show and on our webinars. Send that to us, and we will get those questions over to him to get an answer for you. So thank you all for listening to this show. Don, thanks again to you, and we will see you all next time on the Honestly Adoption Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a resource courtesy of the Honestly Adoption Company. To learn more about us, visit www.honestlyadoption.com.